Hello and welcome to the 2 Cent Table, the podcast where people bring their 2 cents to the table. I'm Brian Bridges and I host this podcast with my mother, Carol Bridges. In the podcast's current state, the majority of these episodes will probably feature guests from our city of Moses Lake and the surrounding area. We'll generally try to keep topics interesting to listeners everywhere, but there may be times when we discuss our city, county, and state specifically. Today we're talking to 3 different authors in our area. We have Sheldon Townsend.
I write because I have these ideas, stories in my head, and if I put them on paper, they leave me alone.
Sheldon writes under the pen name of S. Evan Townsend. We also have E. Hank Buchmann.
10 years it took me to finally get this thing done. This one I wrote in 6 days. It just depends.
If you look him up, Buchmann is spelled B-U-C-H-M-A-N-N. And we also have Jan Thacker.
Every character in my first book is me. I mean, to a certain extent, really.
We'll be learning about their work, what goes into writing a book, their thoughts on feedback, responsibility to readers, writing versus reading, and a number of other topics. At the end of the episode, you'll be able to learn where to find them online and how to buy their books. So now, it's time to listen in on the conversation at the 2 Cent Table.
I write science fiction, and fantasy novels. I currently have 10 published novels, and I'm working on number 11. And they are mostly thrilling books that will make you turn pages quickly.
I write everything. I've got a series of westerns with Marshall Boone Crowe, Wyoming Territory. But every one of my other novels, which I read under Hank Buchmann, E. Hank Buchmann, are different. World War I novel. I have a what I call my New York love story. I could call it a Montana love story too. I have The Homing, which is 1916, the Okanagan country, which is kind of a young adult book. And then my new one, which is in production right now, is totally different from all of that. It's kind of, I don't want to call it futuristic, it's a survival story, but it's based on a solar storm that just instantaneously, some of us wouldn't be here, I think, maybe. Well, we might be. There's a pretty good protection here. So.
But Hank, I've heard your name for years and years, I think associated with the Big Bend College or some kind of a publication, and you've written poetry. I've seen some of that.
Yeah, I have done. This one here is my poetry book that just came out this year.
Say the name.
Natives of Lost Places. And I enlist the help of people that I know are talented, friends. Susan Geese Jensen did the cover for that one and my young adult novel. And my daughter has done a lot of my cover work too. But Brandy Walter is doing my new cover, and I'm really excited to see that in print. So I like people that I know, and it makes it more of a family type thing, and they're all very talented people. So
Good.
yeah, I've been writing poetry and stuff. I won the 7th grade scary story, and that's pretty much what launched me.
that is so
and you know,
cool.
it's been a while since I was in the 7th grade. So.
Jan.
Well, my books are probably more geared toward women, and there's always a romance involved, but this one is really fun, Widows of Danford. I was a humor columnist for 25 years, still write a column, but so there's a lot of humor in my books. My next, I'm going to talk about this one last. My next one is with a publisher right now. It'll be out in about 8 months. It's called Montana Legacy, and it's set in the late 1800s and takes into account the Blackfeet Indian history. But it's a pretty crazy book. It's a lot of fun. And one thing I thought was really fascinating when I started writing about the author thing, and I realized that 26 people in all 4 sides of my family, my great-grandparents and grandparents, they moved to Montana in like the early 1900s, or actually my grandmother was the first white person born in Whitefish. And the fact that all these people converged on that, there was not even a town there, and they all went there. I thought that was really strange. But that one will be out in about 8 months. But this book is about the journey to the bone tree. It's about the death of a young girl, and she and her best friend, kind of their lives, and Anna dies when she's 13. So it's kind of how the parents and the community cope with her death. And actually she drowns. But there are also more fun parts in it. There's a pastor who is a bachelor and everybody's trying to marry him off. But I wrote this book, and I wept through this book and went through all the stages of grief you would go through, and just trying to think about how these families coped with this death. About 3 months after it was written, our son was killed. And his name was Scott. He was just 41 years old. And I saw how God he kind of walked me through all the stages of grief and really allowed me to be able to help my family members cope with it. I'd already gone through it all writing this book. Interesting. Yeah, it was pretty. Anyway, my books normally have a lot of hefty humor in them. And I have 3 more I'm working on, so.
3? Mm.
Yep.
All at one time?
Oh, yeah, which is nuts. I kind of clean house like that, too. You start in the kitchen, and then you take something into this room, and then you have to, anyway. Yep.
So let's talk about the process of writing a book. What do you do? You do the same thing every time? Is it something different every time?
Well, the writing community has these 2 words, plotter and pantser. And plotters line out their book before they're going to write it. They plot it out, they outline it, and they know where they're going to go when they start the book. Pantsers, like myself, start writing the book, may have a vague idea where it's going to go, may have a vague idea how to get there, but they just let it flow. And I've read that Stephen King is a pantser, so he's a successful writer doing that. And I'm a pantser.
How do you spell this word you're saying?
Pant, P-A-N-T.
Pants?
It's like seat of your pants.
Seat of your pants, okay.
Oh, really?
Pant, S-E-R, pantser. And yeah, you're writing by the seat of your pants. And I do that to a point. In the book I'm writing now, I'm about 1/3 of the way through it. And I'm pantsing it, and I'm regretting that because I keep writing myself into corners. And I have to figure out how I'm going to save my hero. But that increases the tension for the reader if I put my hero in a really bad situation and he has to figure out how to get out of it.
Well, I'm very similar to that. I do not plot except for kind of knowing where I want to go, but so vaguely. But I think it's my characters that are the pantsers. The pantsers are in every one of these books. I have been surprised where my editor says, or where my character says, no, go here, not there. And in this book in particular, there's a couple of places where I have it all figured out, and this is where we're going. And then all of a sudden, this naughty lady will say, no, we're going here, which when I realize it, I think, oh, that's going to make her even more wicked than she is already. So we do it, And there's been a few things in my cowboy books where it just, I don't know, it might have been King, it might have been Norman Mailer, it might have been Hemingway, it might have been all of them who said, well-developed characters, you better listen to them because they're almost as real as the person writing.
Do you ever argue with your characters?
When they talk loud, I say they know what they're doing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so there's been one of my books here, I think it was the second book of the Western series, where he was supposed to take the bad guy back to the judge, but he hung him right there because there was a tree, and he was so disgusted. But then at the last minute, my character put his hands over his horse's eyes because he was ashamed of what he just did. He says, I don't want you to see this. And I thought, wow, that's great. But it didn't come from me. It came from my character. So it's a lot of fun.
Okay, I'm going to confess something here because I see a lot of art shows on public TV, and I hear these artists say, well, I just start on the canvas and then I let my painting tell me where it wants to go, and I always make fun of them saying, that's so stupid. So I guess it's real in all kinds of creative processes.
Yeah, I'm definitely a pantser. I never heard that phrase before, but I love it. Yeah, the Widows of Danford, there was this minor character, her name is Lillian Dipp, and she took over. She just, your character, they're real people.
They are, because it's the only
They
company
really
you keep.
are. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
What would you say your inspiration is for where do you come up with ideas? In the middle of the night? Is it 2 a.m.? What
I always
happens?
have a pad and paper by my bed because a lot of times your ideas do come at night. But yeah, they just kind of gel. I don't know about them, but I always have 4 or 5, 6 books rattling around in my head.
Do you think you have to have an idea before you start? I mean, that sounds like obvious, but I mean, if you wanted to write something, could you just sit down in a chair and say, I'm going to write a book?
I think you always need an idea. I'm just finishing the book Water to Elephants, which is fabulous, but Water for Elephants. Anyway, she just read this little tiny article on the circus and just...
That was a good book.
It's amazing, and studied it and learned about circuses and wrote this amazing book. But lots of times your ideas can come from something very small. Yeah.
I would say that's true. And this book here was supposed to be a short story. I was reading a book by Jim Harrison, he passed away in 2016, I guess. Love that guy. I've read so many of his books. He's kind of a dirty old man, but that's what makes him great. And he was out of Livingston, Montana. And gosh, his book, but he had one book there that just had a little scene of a relationship between a girl that was younger than him. It was his sister's friend. And so I got this idea to do that same kind of thing, and it was going to be a short story. It ended up being 550 pages. Then I narrowed it down to 450 pages. And then I got it down to 350 pages, and then I changed the POV to first person, because then it sounds just like you're in the room, sitting across from this guy, and he's telling you his story. 10 years it took me to finally get this thing done. This one I wrote in 6 days. It just depends. Mm-hmm. But I agree with Jan. It only takes a little something to spark this idea. It's because you pay attention. I think writers really pay attention to what's going on around them, and I'm sad to say that so many people don't.
Does that mean that you model some of your characters after people you know?
Oh my goodness, yes. Every character in my first book is me. I mean, to a certain extent, really. I mean, one character, her name is Marge Reynolds, and she's a recluse. She hasn't come out of her house in years, and she's just this poor, pathetic woman. And I went through that. My kids took care of me for 2 years while I suffered endless panic attacks. So, I think we're all a little bit part of our characters.
Yeah, it's always fun to take somebody you know and put them in your book and then kill them. Or have them do something heroic.
Well, I have actually, I killed off a former boss I had because I didn't like him. And so I have done that repeatedly. There's a neighbor in our town that has been a jerk to his wife, and so he's dead in a livery stable somewhere. So you get pleasure out of that. If nothing else, it's poetic justice. Anyway.
Therapeutic.
Yeah.
That's going to make it more fun to read. Now I'm reading your Widows of Danford right now. I'm about 1/4 of the way into it. It's going to be interesting now I'll think,
Hey, that's me. She just killed me.
Oh, yeah. People want to know it. And sometimes they'll say, can I be in one of your books? And I'll say, do you want to be clothed or unclothed? And that kind of makes them at least think then for a minute. And some of them say, I don't care, however you want. So, but I don't do research. Not that deep. It's just fun. It's just fun. Writing is a lot of fun. And if it's not, I remember reading an article once by a guy who had his book published. And he says, writing is just a lot of work. And I thought, you're nuts. Mm-hmm. It's so much fun. If it's not fun, you're in the wrong business.
The way you're doing it.
So,
yeah. It's work, but it's fun work.
Yeah, it is a lot of work. And I can go out and mow 4 lawns and be less tired than if I'm plotting out or writing out a paragraph all day.
And it takes a lot of patience and understanding and faith from your family members. Yeah. Patience and understanding that spending all this time doing something and
actually
trust that you're actually writing and not in there playing Spider Solitaire.
So why do you write, Sheldon?
I write because I have these ideas, stories in my head, and if I put them on paper, they leave me alone. But if I don't, they just, as Hank said, swirl around in my head, and I have to get them out. Plus, it's fun.
You would never get any sleep if you ignored them.
That's true. That's absolutely true. Writing a scene, it depends on the scene. Writing an action scene can be a lot of fun. Writing two people talking about their plans can be a lot of fun. Just writing is fun, but it's hard work. This morning I wrote 100. I wish I wrote 100,000 words. I wrote 1,000 words this morning, and then I had to take a break because that was today's writing, and I'm not going to write any more today. Actually, I got 1,088, but not that I'm counting.
You all write fiction. Sheldon, yours is a little different because it's science fiction and fantasy. A little different meaning this question that I'm asking. I get frustrated with some fiction because I think to myself, that wouldn't happen. And people say to me when I watch a movie and I say, that wouldn't happen. They say, it's a movie. And sometimes I ask too much, I think, of a book. Do you find yourself re-editing and looking at your work as if, could this really happen? Or do you take the view of, this is a book, it's a story. I'm not telling you that it's real, it's a story.
I have two wonderful friends who are both writers, and they're both teachers, ex-teachers, but now they write fiction, and I send my stuff to them, and they come back with, but this doesn't work, or this is really good, and it's really helpful. Yeah, because you get so entangled in your own work, you really don't see it as others would see it sometimes, I think.
My wife and my editor both would be those people. Actually, when my editor and I are done working on everything, and we order that proof, my wife is the one who goes and reads, and she still finds things that we've missed. But as far as how the story, she's the one who would say, that's not feasible. But I try really hard not to I want things to say, okay, this could really happen. The one that's coming out, it's not fantasy and it's not science fiction. It could be tomorrow. And this solar storm, which sweeps the nation, or not the nation, the planet, is instantaneous. And many, many soft tissue people have just been disintegrated. But the two characters it's called Nightly Crossings. The two characters one is a 52-year-old poetry professor, originally from Montana, but he's been working in Boston for most of his career. The other one is an 18-year-old college freshman. And they ended up being on opposite ends of Mexico when this thing hit. And somehow they come together, and then, of course, together they make this trek. So the instant thought is, oh, this guy's a dirty old man. He is going to, And yet, Nightly Crossings has more to do with his passage from who he has been to who he really wants to be. And he said, this girl, I love her for her innocence. And so that's a whole different twist. And yet, whatever it was, this apocalyptic moment, is just kind of a background for their journey. It could have been a journey without all that, but I wanted to get my comments in there. There's no more politicians. We don't have to worry about that anymore. And there's no more cell phones. We don't have to worry about that anymore. So anyway, but I think that's a story that was in me from the time I was a kid. Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little different in my world because in the fantasy world, yes, things are going to happen that can't happen. There aren't fire-breathing dragons in the real world like there are in my novel Agent of Artifice, which is set in the 50s, so you got fire-breathing dragon in the 50s. But you have to have the characters be true. You can't have the characters do weird things and say, well, it's fantasy, they can do that. They have to be true to themselves. They have to act like humans. You put them against this backdrop of fantasy or science fiction, but even if it's fantasy and science fiction, they have to act like humans. They can't act like aliens. Now, if you got aliens, you can have them act like aliens. But, excuse me, you can't have a girl fall in love with a guy in 15 minutes, because that's not going to happen. Not love, maybe desire, but there's all sorts of things you can't have humans do. And characters aren't my strongest suit. I'm better at writing the shootouts, but you got to keep your characters realistic if they're human. And if they're aliens, they have to be consistent. If an alien can fall in love in 15 minutes, then it can't take them a year the next time.
So who did you research when you were writing the aliens?
I just made them up.
Oh, okay, all right. I thought maybe you had family members or something.
No.
So how does feedback affect you?
Oh, I'm glad you brought that topic up because I love feedback. Amazon reviews are incredibly important. And Journey to the Bone Tree, I probably had 20 reviews on it. And about 6 months ago, I went on there and it was down to 6. Now it's down, I think, to 3. And I wrote to Amazon and said, what are you doing? And they are taking reviews off that they think might be too good. And I have another author who's a friend, and she sent me an email today, and she said that the Amazon Grinch has been added again. I'm down another 2 reviews. And evidently some writers were making accounts and posing as people and putting out really good reviews.
Or having their family write good reviews. And Amazon is trying to get away from family and friend reviews.
They are.
So if they think it's a family or friend review, they're taking it away.
They chop them off.
Yeah, I haven't had any reviews taken away yet. So
I probably had it, like I said, I had about 20 on this book, and now I'm down, I think, to 3. And one was because I helped, my book helped somebody cope with a death, and this was a really heartfelt review, and it just made me cry, and it's gone. I mean, there's nothing you can do to combat it. You just can't. It's at their whim. But I'll bet you Tom Clancy doesn't have reviews go away.
Or John Grisham.
Or John Grisham or anybody else.
I don't look at them, but when I do go in there, I'm kind of at war with Amazon. It's one of those things like you got to put up with them because they're the ones that people order their books from. But they're out to take over the world, and I feel like, well, in my new book, they probably would have been one of the first to go because greed always goes that way. And I thought Teddy Roosevelt stopped monopolies, but they're shooting for monopoly. And so I try to give as much support as I can to Barnes & Noble. And my books are in Barnes & Noble too. And but I don't get a lot of reviews, and I'm not really sure why. I don't know if there's something I'm not doing to get those reviews, but the ones I get are good. I've only had a couple that questioned something I did, and I thought, but there's always those people that only read to find mistakes.
It's true.
And I'll admit, there'll be a mistake or two in my books, but there'll be a mistake in Simon & Schuster books that I've read too. Mm-hmm. So I don't really worry about that kind of stuff. Did you like this story? Oh, yeah, well, let me see. Well, I got to think about whether it was any good or not. Yeah, I don't care what you have to say because you're reading for the wrong reason. So, yeah, my editor doesn't even really look, and she gets a lot of reviews, but she doesn't pay attention to him. She says, Hemingway, that was probably part of why he killed himself. He was obsessed.
With reviews?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, he was obsessed with reviews, and of course he had other issues too. A lot of other issues, but it's not worth it. There's always going to be some crank somewhere.
I had a review on one of my novels complaining about the bad grammar in my novel, which, as far as I know, there wasn't any, unless it was a character who had bad grammar. And the review had bad grammar in it. So I didn't take that person too seriously.
He don't write good.
My wife tells me I don't talk good, and I say, hey, I'm just talking like my characters.
Practicing. So let's talk about discipline, finishing a book.
I'm a firm believer in writing one book at a time, even though I might have 2 or 3.
Did you hear that, Jan?
Did you hear that, Jan? Even though I might have 2 or 3 in my mind, what I'll do if I come up with an idea for another book in the middle of a book is I'll maybe write the first pages of it, write down some notes and say, we'll come back to this later. But you have to have discipline. I did a blog post on this on my blog post. You have to finish the book. and you have to go through all the work and all the editing. It's fun to write that first draft, and editing is pure heck. But you got to do it. You got to do the work. And otherwise, I've talked to people, oh, I've got 6 books started. Have you finished any? No. You need to finish your book.
And I do that. I finish one at a time. But I'm like you. You get a good idea and you don't want to lose it, so you write down and...
Well, I finish what I'm writing. My problem is I've got so many things out there. So on the heels of this book, Nightly Crossing, my 7th Western will be coming out probably this year too. And I'm working on my short story collection. And I could list off some books that I haven't even talked about, Holding the Hand of Hearts. There's so many of them that I have, and some of them are complete, Leaving Dakota. But like what Sheldon says, they're done for the most part, but they need to be re-edited and stuff like that. So I finished a book, but when you said that, I thought you meant ending a book. So maybe we can do that later, but yeah.
It's like writing in high school. We had to write many times creative writing. I found the first sentence is terrible for me. That first sentence, trying to figure out what to say. So a lot of times I'd just start writing and then go back and make a first sentence afterwards. But yeah, how do you finish? An ending, come up with an ending. And how do you know when you're, didn't you say that? How do you know when you're done?
When the bad guy's dead.
God, science fiction and fantasy is so easy.
Yeah, bad guy's dead.
Well, Jan, I'm curious, when do you know it's done?
Well, they just are. But my 2 author friends who did my next book, Montana Legacy, they didn't like the way it ended. So, yeah.
Well, in this one here, I got a lot of heat. And I said, well, look at the stinking title, for crying out loud. It's not a cheerful title.
Dead Woman Creek.
But that was my first thing. And I honestly thought, because I grew up on a farm with horses and cows, and I thought, I have one cowboy book in me, I got to write it. I had and you were talking about women liking I have more women readers here. They fall in love with that crusty old guy, and they want more. And so after I did the first one, they said, when's the second one coming out? I go, second one? There's not going to be a second one. But then I thought, oh, I do have another story in me. So now I'm working on number 7, and it's like, you get so attached, you're like a family member. Mm-hmm. But as far as endings go, I think you just know. Mm-hmm. You know when it's done. And I always try to leave my readers with something that's dynamic. If I can write dynamically, I want them to walk away and say, I'll never forget the way that book ended. So I do try to work hard in that, whether it works or not. Yeah, so I'm more of a happy guy. I can have in my World War I book, which one of my favorites, Edmund Ellicott. He's an old man. Everybody knows you're going to die when you're really an old man. But there's something so sweet about it that you're okay with it. And so, yeah, there's a story behind that one, too.
So Anne Lamott says one of the secrets to discipline and finishing is butt in the chair. Sit down and do it. Every day you have to sit down and work on it.
And it's also, I get tangled up sometimes doing like Facebook long posts. Well, I was a newspaper reporter for so long and a columnist for so long and then I still write for the venue sometimes, but you kind of sometimes you get lost doing other writing rather than sitting down and working on your novels, which is a no-no. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It
is. It's butt in the chair. You got to sit there and write. And you should write every day, write something, maybe not on your novel. I do freelance writing, and so some days I don't write on my novel. I write on a story for a freelance assignment. Some days I don't write on my novel. I tinker around and write something else. And I've actually gotten novels out of my tinkering. I'll say, I'll just write this cute little scene. And I go, I can write a novel about that. But writing is like any other craft, any other art. You have to practice it. You have to work on it. You hopefully get better every time you do it. Hopefully every one of my books has gotten better. I hope. I hope. And you just got to work at it. And if you don't work at it every day, it's going to atrophy. Sometimes I don't write on Saturday and Sunday because I get busy, but every weekday I butt in the chair.
So it's like a job.
Yeah, but it's a 3-hour job instead of a 8-hour job.
Maybe I'm different. I probably am different, but there'll be times when I don't write. I haven't written in my cowboy book for several weeks actually, because life gets in the way. But when I'm in that little gap area, that's when I start writing poetry. And I've written some good, I think, good poetry to make up for, still stimulating my brain and stuff like that. But when it comes to endings and how I want to play that out, by the time I have written this whole book, I'm not necessarily a character in the book, but I am so much a part of this book that I don't want to rush it. And so a lot of times when I know I'm getting close, I have to let it come. When I teach creative writing, and I've been doing that for a long time to students and even down there at the MAC once in a while, and I have a saying that I made up, and if Stephen King steals it, I'll sue him. But I always say to my students, writing isn't something you make happen, it's something you let happen. And I think writers already have the story in them, and you just have to let it out. So when I get to an ending, I got to know for sure it hasn't been forced. So, yeah, and you talked about tears. Oh my gosh. There's a scene in here and in the one that I just finished and is going to be out. I wrote it originally through tears, and when I edited it a couple of days ago, I was glad my wife wasn't there because I had to wipe the tears away. And I'm thinking, if I can get emotional about something like that, I'm in it. Mm-hmm. And this scene here, this poor guy he thinks he's lost everything. And he goes to find his first girlfriend. And she's married with children. And it breaks his heart because he kept thinking that the improbable would happen, that she'd still be there waiting for him. But she has such good words for him, and then she pulls him behind a tree where her kids can't see and puts a big old kiss on him. That's all he's going to get. But it was such a tender scene that I felt so sorry for him. I wanted to go and pat him on, you're going to be okay.
Which book is that one?
That was, it's my, let's see, which one was it? It was in this one.
Oh, that one. Oh, my goodness.
Well, I wrote a book called Book of Death, and about spoiler alert, 2/3 through it, the hero realizes that the bad guy's his love interest. And he has to hunt her down, and he tries not to kill her, but he has to in self-defense. And and it's a fantasy. It is a lighthearted fantasy novel. And I'm at the end of this novel and I'm crying because he had to kill his girlfriend to save the world.
Well, mine isn't about people. My sad one is in here about a horse. And I could still read that and cry over it each time I read it.
Yeah, I know. Which just tells me that I was telling somebody the other day that when I write something so magnificent in my eyes, it didn't come from me. It came from God. I mean, it's God's words. I'm a tool for him, and whatever he wants my little silly books to become, that's up to him. And that's kind of where I am right now. It's like, I don't want to be a New York bestseller because that would bring so much extra work on my head I don't want.
Pressure.
Yeah, I just have a good time,
That's what I told my friend today who sent me the email saying that the Amazon Grinch had stolen more reviews. And I told her, if our books reach one person, make one life better, that's the reward we're getting. And if we get to heaven and God says, this book really touched a lot of people, that's when we're going to get the good reviews. Yep.
So it sounds like you feel a responsibility to your readers. Do you think that the author or the artist, however you see it, has a responsibility to his audience. And I don't know whether to call it a moral responsibility or exactly what to call it. But I've asked artists this, and so far everybody had a strong no. And they said that art is a creative process. It comes out of it's an expression for me, and how you interpret it is not my responsibility, nor is it my, I can't, once you let it go, you let it go. And I mean, it's kind of a difficult question, but I would like to hear how you feel about that.
Well, I think your moral stance plays a big role. If you're an artist creating a painting, you're not going to do some X-rated painting. It's just not in your personality to do something like that. Same thing with writing. I think your morals come through. Yeah.
You know, I'm not those people you've been talking to. I always think about my readers, and I don't care about the readers that I'm not trying to reach. I'm trying to reach readers that have a heart. And I think there's a lot of people out there that just read because they say, well, I read 200 books this year. I said, can you name one? Oh, then she got to ask her friend, did I read that one or not? I don't remember. And so you know what they're reading, and it just doesn't matter. But if I only write, but in all of my books, there are scenes that I want the reader to say, oh my gosh, what would I do in that situation? Especially the new one that's coming out. Even in my Western series, he'll let it fly an SOB once in a while. But I got a review one time from a woman reading my Westerns, and she said, I am so glad that you don't use the Lord's name in vain. And it made me happy that somebody actually noticed that I did that, didn't do it. And so I put a one-armed preacher as a regular character in my books. And he runs a little chapel in the harlot section of an imaginary town in Wyoming. But he's always got something to say that sticks in Boone Crow's mind, and then he shares that with somebody. He's not an overly religious marshal, but he listens, and he realizes that my one-armed preacher, he's got it. So I really want to stick to that. I want my readers to like what I write, and so.
Yeah, I feel a responsibility to the reader. I'm not responsible if they hate the book or they misinterpret the book, because people come with different perspectives. But I try to entertain and educate. And in my fantasy novels, they're all history. All take place in the past. And so I'm educating about history and what happened in the past. In my science fiction novels, I'm usually educating about science or something scientific. And that's my goal. My biggest goal is to be read by strangers. Not have my family or friends be my only readers. I want strangers to read my books. And hopefully they get out of them, entertainment, because I think it was the head of MGM Studios who said, if you want to send a message, go to Western Union, and B, a little education, I love it when I read a fiction book and I learn something while I'm enjoying the fiction, the ride, and that's what I try to do.
Sometimes what you learn is just how to write better.
Yeah.
And you can, I have two books that I learned so much from. One of my sons, when he was just a little kid, he's in his mid-30s now, he bought me at a garage sale a book called The Eighth Day. And it was by Thornton Wilder. And I thought, oh boy, a big, thick thing. I'll read it. No, I'll read it, son. But I took it to work with me, and on my lunch hours, I would read it. And I got halfway through this book, and the main character drowns in the ocean. What is going on? And I learned that you can do that. Something else that I learned is a book called Boys in the Trees, written by, the gal's name escapes me right now, but it's a story about a family in a little village in Canada or something, but in the end, the father has killed the family and he's in prison. But it never says what the motive was. Never talks about why he did it, only that he did it. And I thought, you know what? The reader doesn't always have to know everything. It doesn't always have to be all tied up, because we go through life not always knowing how things are going to turn out. And I learned that when I can put that into a book too.
I don't know. I think I'd be mad when I got done. I'd be laying there at night thinking, no.
Well, see, that's part of it, though. See, it makes you start thinking
Yes, it
you
would.
can end a story.
Hey, it's Brian here again. We'll be right back to continue with this episode, but I'd like to take a quick moment to share a bit about myself and my other work. This podcast is a side project I've started with the interest of learning about some of the people in our area to promote them and glean some knowledge from them. But my main work is video production. My business is Video Street Productions, and I make social media commercials for business, I film highlight videos of corporate events, and I've done mini documentaries and day-in-the-life videos. My goal with Video Street Productions is to make high-quality videos available to people and business owners outside of the larger metropolitan-type cities. If this is a service you could use, feel free to check out some of my work at video-street.com. That's dash as in the hyphen symbol. From there, you can learn more about pricing and details and contact me from the contact page. My work can also be found on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Search for Video Street Productions, or you can search for the hashtag VSPWA. And now let's return to the conversation at the 2 cent table.
Brian has actually written a book. Probably didn't want to talk about that, did you?
I've gotten one book done. I'm about a quarter to a third of my second one, and some of the questions that it made me think about are, one is, what has writing done for you? Out of all the books you've done, where are you now from where you were before?
As in your talent.
In anything. It could even be life and learning and insight and all sorts of things. I would say I've learned, my first one, as with all first books, I think I look back and I cringe at some of it, but it gave me, obviously it gave me a lot more knowledge going into the second one. And the second one, I have done more research in terms of, it's set in kind of, it's a fictional world, but it's set in kind of a 18th century Royal Navy setting. So I've had to learn about ships and hierarchy and the era and what they ate and what they wore, where they got their clothes and all these things to make my book believable. And what it's done for me in that regard is all the things that I've learned, you could just learn them in school or something, but it's really locked them in my brain because I've had to use these things to tell a story. And beyond that, there's just grammar and there's spelling, and I've learned new words, and I've gotten like a better vocabulary for, I've had to look up synonyms and thesaurus and stuff because I use the same word too many times. And so there's a lot of things that I've benefited and a lot of knowledge I've gained just from writing fictional stories. And I've only written 2 books, not 7,
Well, my wife read, she watched the movie and fell in love with this Russell Crowe. Good grief. He's probably a jerk in real life. But when she watched Master and Commander, she ended up reading the whole 21-book set in like a year and a half. And it just happened to be she had a student teacher that year. So when she turned the class over to him, she'd sit in the staff lounge and read this book. But she read 21 of these pretty much in a row. And I'm about halfway, now probably about a third way through the Hornblower series. But when she was done, and she's forgotten a lot of it, but she said, "Oh my gosh, I could probably sail a ship right now." But it was by Patrick O'Brien, and then he came out with a book called The Lexicon. And so there is a book on terms that you can get, which I bought for her, and of course I bought it too late because she was basically done. She had a couple more books left. But the lexicon talks about all the terminology and all that kind of stuff. And there it is right in front of you in a book. So I don't know if that would be
There you go. You should have had that.
Yeah, and is your book's out?
It's
your first one?
The one that I was researching is still in the works, and one thing about the research is that I've had to research things that I would not have normally have learned. Like you can learn about how the different positions on a ship, the captain, the lieutenants, and you can learn about the decks of the ship and stuff like that. And that's all pretty common knowledge. But then you have to get into the things like, because you're writing a story, you have to ask yourself, they're going to go into this tavern and get a drink. Well, what did they even drink? Did they even have wine in the taverns? Did they even have coffee back then? And there's all these details that I've had to just stop my writing and go look it up and open the books and turn on the internet. And it's been interesting because I've learned, yes, they did have coffee. And they did have wine, but it was more expensive, and you might find it at a tavern, but maybe not the inn. So there's all these little details that it's just because I'm writing a story, I have to learn even the minute things.
Well, Robert Louis Stevenson has been great in that way. Of course, he's written a lot of things that have nothing to do with the sailing, but a friend of mine, Elisa Weiss, went to England last year, and she brought me back an old copy of Kidnapped. And of course, that I reread Treasure Island and The Black Arrow and some of his travelogue books and everything. But you can talk a lot about sailing and captaining without having to get too much in detail. In this book here, there's chunks of it that have to do with China and the coal mining in China. But I've never been to China. So, like you, I had to really figure some things out. Thank you, National Geographic. Thank you for these big coffee table books.
Thank you, Internet.
Yeah, it's part of the fun, though, is when you learn new things.
Yeah, my novel, Agent of Artifice, a lot of it takes place in pre-revolutionary Cuba. So I had to it was pre-revolutionary Havana-like. And it was fun to learn all that stuff and compare it to how it is now. And then I came across a movie called Our Men in Havana that was set in pre-revolutionary Havana, filmed in pre-revolutionary Havana, like 2 years before the revolution. And I was watching that movie going, wow, I even wrote about that place.
How interesting.
Yeah.
What's writing done for you, Jan?
Well, I've learned a great deal. Yeah, I love the research, though. The book that's coming out, Montana Legacy, it's got a lot of the Blackfeet history in it, and that was just really, really interesting to learn all that. But the thing of it is you have to be timely, too, because it's the turn of the century, so you can't throw in their cell phone. I mean, you have to... Yeah,
it's hard for me to even really remember when we didn't have a cell phone.
I know.
What did we do?
We had a pretty good life, I'd say.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
How well do you know your work when it's done? If I quoted a line would you say, oh, that's from my book? Or do you recognize it? Do you know it well enough? Because you've written several.
If it's a good line.
If it's a good line.
It can't be, he turned a corner and walked in the door.
Jesus wept. What's that from? I don't know.
Even though that's a powerful line.
Yeah, the first books I wrote, it's going on 8 years now. If you quoted me a line from them that was something significant, I could probably identify it. If he said he walked down the street, then I probably couldn't.
Yeah, I think I could do that.
Yeah, you kind of leave these behind, and then you're really involved in the one you're working on and thinking ahead of the ones that are coming.
Yeah. And yet you've lived it while you were writing it, so it should be more important than just have forgotten. Yeah.
Let's talk about the difference between writing books and reading books, and the influence that the two have on each other. And I can kick it off. Since I've started writing, I read differently, and as I'm reading, I'm also thinking about writing. And a lot of times I'll see something that an author has done, and I'll think about, how would I have handled this situation? Or, would I have written the book that way or made the story go that way? And I also ask myself a lot of the questions that we've been asking today about process, like you're talking about fly by the seat of your pants versus structure. I'm kind of a structure guy. And then within that structure, I'll let the characters meander a bit. But it's interesting to read books by authors, like you said, Stephen King, if he does Fly by the Seat of His Pants, I might read that and say, well, I can't do that because I'm locked in a structure. He did something that I wouldn't have been able to do,
Yeah, I am. I learn something from every book I read. It doesn't matter what genre, you always learn something from the way other people structure a sentence or the way their thought processes work, or even small things, the way their chapters are lined out, or things like that. But I'm really cautious. Before I really started writing, I could read 2 or 3 books a week. I just was constantly reading books. Now I really limit myself on how much I do, because I should be writing rather than reading other people's work. So I kind of limit my reading.
I'm finding that I'm reading more nonfiction now than I ever did before, and I love history. And several years ago, I realized I didn't know anything about World War I. And so 40 books later, I know a lot about World War I. But the Until the Names Grow Blurred, which is my World War I, and I didn't bring a copy here. I was an activities director in New Jersey for a year. And it's there where I realized that these old people were not just old people. And one of them had survived the Baton Death March. One of the other ones was a jet pilot in the Korean War. And yet you look at them, this couldn't be possible. They're old people. And so there was a lady she says, I'm blind now, but I can still see. The day that my mom and dad, they died like 2 days apart from each other from the Spanish influenza in 1918. They lived in Philadelphia, and she says, I can still see the caskets stacked in front of the row houses because the sanitation department could not keep up. And so I went to the school down the road, and I invited kids to come in and start writing these things down. So years later, I said, that's a book. Mm-hmm. And so I have a young girl coming in to interview Edmund. And you talk about reviews. If you know old people, they don't think in a straight line. They'll be here 1 second and over here the next. And yet I had a review from a woman who said, well, if you would have just told it straight, it would have been easier to follow. But you were jumping around all the time. And I thought, well, number one, that's literature. And number two, that's the way they think. They don't think on a plane. 1 minute they're back in the trenches, next minute they're complaining because of the ice cream in the nursing home. And I know because my dad died a year and a half ago at 99, and he spent his last 5 or 6 years in the nursing home. And so, but I'm proud of that book. And the title, Until the Names Grow Blurred, is a line from one of Wilfred Owen's books. Now, he died November 4th, 1918, and 50 years later to the day, November 4th, 1968, I went into the Army. My dad died on November 4th. So it is a real link there. So, but anyway, there's so much that goes into these ideas and things that you get. I'm not going to take any more time. Sheldon, it's your turn.
What was the question? Reading books, reading other people's work. I was reading a car magazine this morning that I subscribe to called Car and Driver. One reason I subscribe to it is, well, A, I like cars, and B, it's so well written. And it's
in a magazine.
In a magazine.
Really?
And it's humorous, and they come up with these metaphors, and where did they come up with this? Because how many times can you describe what a car does? So they come up with these metaphors, and I don't ever think I've read the same metaphor twice in this magazine. And how can you describe a car understeering with a metaphor 3,000 times and still come up with something new? And if I read fiction or even nonfiction, but mostly fiction, the way I watch for the way they write things, how they use their metaphors, how they use their similes, how they describe things. I'm really bad at description. I just want to write the scene. I always have to go back and add more description as I'm editing the story. And I'll quote Hemingway. He said, all first drafts are crap, except he didn't say crap. And I totally believe that. You have to go back and rewrite and revise and edit. And I watch the writing, and I sometimes have to stop reading, and I go, wow, that was really good writing. Let me read that again. Wow, that's really good. Can I do that? And so I challenge myself to try to write at their level. And the last book I read was Artemis by Andy Weir, and it was a pretty good book. He challenged himself. It's first person, but his main character is a woman. So, and he's a guy, so he wrote first person for a woman. I don't think I would try that. That sounds really hard. He said, well, I had some women friends help me out with that in the acknowledgments at the back. But the way he described things happening there from the perspective of the woman, and she's like a early 20s age woman, I thought, I don't think I could do that, but I've learned that it's possible. So, yeah, you learn if you read. You learn from what you read. Almost, unless you're reading Harlequin romances, maybe then you won't learn anything because they're kind of formulaic.
That reminded me of what I was trying to think of. Since I've started writing, what it's done for the books that I read now is I used to read them and just think that was a fun story. Now that I'm a writer, I kind of reverse engineer everything I read. And I'm more observant about their structure and their plot points and what their characters are like. And it's also made me hyper aware of things because I'm always analyzing my own writing and trying to say, is this any good? Is it plausible? And so as I'm going through my own writing, I'm looking out for all these things, trying to see if there's any repeat words, trying to say. And so when I read other people's books, I'm still hyper aware, and I'm noticing all these things that I would never.
So you're one of those bad guys.
I am, but not to bash on a book, but just to learn for myself. It's a critique. It's a self-critique,
So what do you think of e-readers?
Like my Kindle?
Yeah.
Oh, I love my Kindle.
You love your Kindle?
I love my Kindle,
Even
yes.
though you aren't feeling the book in your hand? And
I love my Kindle. Actually, you make more royalties on ebooks than you do on your hard copies.
Amazon steals your other ones.
Yep.
Someone said 55%.
Yeah. But the cool thing about your Kindle, you can put your manuscripts on it, and for some reason, it's easier for me to catch mistakes reading it on my Kindle, which is wonderful. I love that aspect of my Kindle.
And some people will use the voice to text or text to voice on their Kindle to have the book read to them, and you can catch things when you hear it that you just pass over when you write. When you're saying it.
I don't have a Kindle.
I don't either.
My wife has one and she used it a few times, but we're pretty much book people. The prediction that paper and hardcover books were going to be yesterday's news was a fallacy. They were trying to promote the new Kindle, but it's some people like it, but I don't think I could read that way.
I once read a whole novel on my iPhone in the Kindle app.
That's why you wear glasses now.
That's right. I believe, but about every paragraph I was swiping.
Well, there's a few authors that when I see they have a new book out, I buy it and I read it. Robert Olmsted is one of those guys. I don't want to say he writes like Cormac McCarthy, but there's it's war but his usage of language is so beautiful. He can describe a horrible battle in a way that you really appreciate. Of course, Jim Harrison, I really like him. But if I'm reading a bunch of nonfiction or even a really heavy novel, and I think, I got to take a break, it's always Zane Grey. He's the one I go to. And, he was a marketing genius because he had gone out west where so few people had ever gone. And he always put a damsel in distress. And he knew how the New Yorkers and the Philadelphia people they were hungry to see the West, and that was the way he presented it. But he had I've read Louis L'Amour too, but he can't hold a candle to Zane Grey. And I've seen some mistakes in his books that give me a break. He's written some good ones, but when you write as many as he did, it's like a machine, you're a machine. I don't know if he ever really got into all his characters like that. I'd rather write a few books than, a bunch.
Well, I use my Kindle on the, what do you call it?
Airplane?
Yeah, that.
While you're driving?
No, I'm walking on the treadmill. No, I use a Kindle when I'm walking on the treadmill because it's too hard to turn pages or if you're doing any kind of exercise. And so that's when I started reading a lot more fiction because I've never been a fiction reader, except I read thousands of books to my children, but literally thousands of books to my children. But so I read your Gods of Strife.
Yeah.
Is that the right? On the Kindle, because then it takes my mind away from what I'm doing.
Reality?
Yeah, it does, and it makes the time go by more quickly. But if I have to read something that's like something that's a nonfiction that requires thinking and processing, and I don't want to do that on the treadmill. So it's entertaining and it makes the time go by more quickly. But I like books. I like to hold a book, and I don't like to share my books with, like, my husband kind of likes to turn the back cover around. Everybody shuddering, you know what I mean?
Oh, I don't have a Kindle either, mostly because I like books. But a friend of mine said, well, when I go to visit my grandma, it used to be I took a case full of books. I'd go to the library and borrow all the books I could borrow. I'd take every other book I had. I'd put them in a big heavy case. I'd lug them all the way down to my grandmother's house. I'd read about half of them, and I'd be done. I'd read all of them about half the time I'm going to be there, and then I'd be done. Now I have 1,000 novels on my Kindle, and it weighs, I can put it in my purse. And so I can see the appeal of the Kindle, but I read recently that ebook sales are down and hard copy, paperback book sales are climbing back up again. So I think the Kindle is the novelty of it is going away.
You asked a question about thinking about your audience, and when I wrote this book, it was based on my 14 years at Frontier Middle School.
Which one is that?
The Homing.
The Homing.
And there were kids that I knew there that weren't getting love like they should from the places they should. And I remember a girl there who said, oh, Dad just got married again, and his new wife has 3 kids, and us 3 girls are all sleeping on a mattress on the floor. And I'm thinking, and you got to listen to these kids. So I got this idea, and the plotting and everything. But anyway, long story short, it's about you don't always find love where you should, but it's still out there. And so after the shooting at Freeman High School in September of last year, I went up there. I felt moved, to go up there, and I took 3 copies of it up there to the librarian. And I said, I just want to donate these to the library. So about a month later, she sends me an email back. She says, oh my gosh, these kids are devouring these books.
Really?
Would you come and talk to our lit circle? I said, yeah, I would. And so before I even got there, she says, oh, and would you teach 3 freshman classes too? And so I did, yeah. And so then it was such a wonderful day, and these kids are so nice and wonderful, and they had just come through some rough times, and they were dealing with it by talking about it. And so we talked about the book and everything, but then they said, we've got some kids that are writing. If I send you some of their work, would you make comments? And I said, I will make comments, and I will come back up. And I gave a copy to all 5 of the kids that had done that. So that's like a paycheck. Amazon couldn't give me a paycheck worth what I just had with that experience. To me, that's part of why I write.
Mm-hmm. That's a good story.
Any final thoughts or things that you wish we had covered?
I would like to point out that I write under S. Evan Townsend, EVAN, and you can find everything you want to know about me, including links to all my books, at sevantownsend.com.
I don't have a website, but I'm on Facebook, E. Hank Buchmann. It should be Buchmann, because that B-U-C-H is book in German, but I was Buchmannized so many years ago, why fight it? But my westerns are written under the pen name of Buck Edwards. But it's still me. I'm the same guy. And so you can follow me on Facebook on E. Hank Buchmann. There's also a Buck Edwards site that I go to once in a while.
What's the E stand for?
Edward.
Edward.
Yeah. I'm Edward Henry Buchmann or Bookman Jr.
Oh, so yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And Hank Williams.
So none of your names are right.
No. Well, the funny thing is, my wife said, we got to have a different name. So she turned my name backwards. Buck Edwards instead of Edward Buckman.
There you go.
So she's a clever gal.
Yeah.
And I'm on Facebook, Jan Thacker. And janthacker.com is my website.
And you have books here at the Red Door
Oh,
Cafe.
got
That's
books
where
here.
I got mine. Mhm.
I have them in several places too.
You
I've got
do?
them at Pearl Street at Ellensburg.
Mason's?
I've got them at Mason's. I've got them in a couple of other stores. I've got them up at Cooley City at the coffee shop up there, and of course on Barnes and Noble and Amazon.
I have my last 3 books, which are a science fiction series, up at Mason's. Otherwise, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kindle. Come find me. I'll sell you a book.
Did you say confine you?
Come find me. No, not find me.
Confine you. Yeah.
Confine me,
you
yeah,
to
but-
quarters. Yeah.
No,
There's
no.
a term for you. Get below deck here. Yeah.
You don't have them at the library? Do they do fiction
No,
there?
I don't.
You do. Mhm.
I don't. I didn't know
Sheldon
you could do
does
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, mine are at the library. Some of them are anyway. I don't know. They do that stuff. I don't pay attention.
All right. Thanks for joining us, guys.
Thank you. Yeah, interesting.
If you want to search online for the 2 Cent Table podcast, here are the places you can find us: Podbean, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and YouTube. You can follow us on social media as well on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you have a topic idea for the show, if you'd like to be on the show, or if you have a way to connect us with some interesting potential guests, feel free to message us on any of our media platforms or email 2centtable@gmail.com. The 2 in that email address is TWO. And we'll consider your idea for future episodes. But that's all we have for this episode, so we'll see you on the next one.